1 minute. Let a few more people come in. All right. Good morning. My name is Karsten Friis. I head our research on security and defense matters, including our cybersecurity center. Well, I don't head that. Niels is doing that. He's not here. Where's Niels? He's sleeping still. Welcome to this very timely seminar. It's fully booked, so please find some seats in the front row here if you want, people. So make sure that people coming a bit late can find space. Right. As you know, 2 days ago, the Police Secret Service said publicly that we should be, I don't remember exact wording in English, but something about be careful about Huawei. And our Minister of Justice had said something similar earlier, and other, we heard that same from other countries. At the same time, Huawei are, arguing we had done nothing wrong ever. Actually, we had the most transparent systems in the world. We're building cybersecurity centers for governments to test our software and our systems. Still, this concern. So, what's this all about? Why are we concerned? Is it cunning plot, or is it something real? Right. So, we're going to learn more about that today. Not particularly on Huawei, particularly about Chinese and Western companies. In our cybersecurity center, we take pride in bringing up not only the established researchers, but also the younger ones, the new generations, going to be the experts on these topics in the future. And Valentin Weber is one of them. He's here today. He's a PhD student at Oxford University. Although he's only a PhD student, he has a long bio here, already done a lot. I'll not read it all to you, but you can find it online. But I'll also mention that you're also affiliated to Harvard, to something called the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, where you are a fellow, in addition to working with Lucas Kello, I think is a supervisor, who has also been here before, in Oxford. So, with no further ado, I will leave the floor to Valentin. He will talk for half an hour or something, half an hour, 45 minutes, and then we'll of course open for Q&A afterwards. Let me also remind you, as always, that this event is streamed live, so if you miss some point, you can go back on YouTube later and find what was being said. So, with no further ado, please, the floor is yours, Valentin. I'm breaking my coffee here.
Thank you, Karsten. Does it work?
Yep.
For inviting me and for hosting me. It's nice to see already some familiar faces within the audience. So as Karsten just mentioned, we will be today talking about Chinese cybersecurity and what that means for Europe. And there was a lot in the news recently, as recent as 2 days ago and so on. But also a bit further back, we have seen that there was Huawei's chief financial officer, which was arrested in Vancouver. Then there was also some arrests in Poland, in Eastern Europe, for where there were 2 individuals being detained for allegedly spying, and then the Huawei employee was immediately fired after that. And then there were also some countries which imposed bans on Huawei and ZTE from accessing their markets, and one of them was Australia. So let's see what Huawei said on that when Australia banned or excluded them from their market. They said that the Australian government's decision to block Huawei from Australia's 5G market is politically motivated, not the result of a fact-based, transparent or equitable decision-making process. So that's going to be today the question. Is it really politically motivated, or is it fact-based? Is there a real concern behind those recent concerns? I think the main takeaway of today will be that the international is an extension of the domestic. That means that the Communist Party's influence does not reach only within the companies and within mainland China's borders, but what is being done at home, whether that is in censorship, surveillance or espionage, which applies to China is also reflected in other countries abroad. So there is no, the borders are blurry. That's going to be the main takeaway of today. But let's take a look at two major companies, Baidu and Sina. Baidu is the Google equivalent. You can do searches and so on. And then Sina, which has Weibo, a company which is the Twitter equivalent, the Chinese Twitter equivalent. And those two companies have Chinese Communist Party committees within their corporate structures. And most technology, or most large companies within China have those committees, which are not only on working group level, but they are really at the decision-making level, and they have influence on what's happening domestically, but also internationally. And their role of those committees is to assess a company's daily operations. Their role is also to make sure that the company, whether it's a technology company, whether it's different sectors, that it's their role to assess that they are really aligned with what the party wants, whether it's in different regions or whether it's at home. And there was an interesting paper by Milhaupt and Zhang, who are two American academics, who wrote that many large, successful Chinese firms, both state-owned enterprises and privately owned enterprises, exhibit substantial similarities in terms of market dominance, receipt of state subsidies, proximity to state power, and the execution of the state's development policy objectives. So what does that mean? Paraphrase, that means that there's not really a big difference whether a company is state-owned or privately owned. The Chinese Communist Party has influence within them. And even though Huawei falls within the privately owned enterprise, again, according to those two authors, there's not much of a difference. Even if the state doesn't hold a share within that company, that shouldn't really affect our decision of the company's closeness to the party and its influence. WeChat, another service which is owned by Tencent, a large platform in China as well. Also on WeChat, it's usually you can, it's called also a super app. You can do everything with it. You can write your friends, you can get your laundry done, you can order your food, you can order everything basically. And WeChat does filtering at home, right? They do censorship at home. That means you can't, let's say, write freedom to your friends. You can't write Tiananmen Square because it's just going to be censored. But even if you move abroad, and if you have like your, and even if you get the new international SIM card, that censorship will still apply. Let's say you move back to Norway, you will still get the filtering on your device. And it was interesting, we saw the story by Meng Wanzhou, who was arrested in Vancouver, right, the Huawei official. And if you used WeChat in Vancouver, let's say you just moved to Vancouver and you wanted to read some news and you still wanted to read in Chinese on WeChat, and WeChat has a feature which is called WeChat News. And you wanted to look up what's happening, and you just couldn't get the proper news because it was filtered, it was censored, even if you were in Vancouver. And that example serves to show that whether you are in China or whether you're abroad, the parties' preferences and objectives still reach even into those countries. ZTE, another 5G contender who could build the 5G networks, had a similar case. They are building at home equipment which could be used for the social credit system. I won't go into details because most people have already read about it, but it's mostly a tool also for the government to have surveillance and control over their people. And what ZTE did, they took the technology from home, went to Venezuela and built something called a fatherland card. And on that fatherland card is looks like a, let's say if you have a MasterCard or something, and on it you have like a QR code, and it tells you what your health data, it tells the government your income, but also your political activities. Again, another case in point where surveillance doesn't stop at China's borders. What is being done at home is being reflected internationally. But let's now go to Huawei, because it was a most news is about it, and I think most people are interested. So I'm sorry for that interlude, for this couple of minutes that weren't about their company. But yeah, let's have a look at what those concerns are about. Let's have a look first at what 5G is. It's like the 5th generation network. It's a continuation of the 3rd generation network and the 4G, and it makes everything faster. It allows more data to be transported. It's lower latency. That means, let's say you have a video call and you just won't have any glitches. You can talk to your friends and there is going to be no bad connection, let's say. And what you could also do, what it's going to enable is, let's say, there's going to be in the future autonomous vehicles, and those vehicles are going to produce a lot of data. They will connect to other cars, they will connect to everything, to the infrastructure, and in order to process all of that, 5G is going to be needed in order to enable that. It could be also used in remote surgeries. It could be really make the remote surgeries more common because, and again, if you need video, it's going to be the way to go to allow that for happening. And why is 5G important? It's important because it is core internet infrastructure. It's going to enable a lot of critical services. Let's say the police will use 5G, and if they talk to each other, you as a country want it to be confidential, right? Then if you look at autonomous vehicles, they're going to be driving. You want to have that data that and the algorithms that those vehicles use to be have integrity, right? You don't want those cars to crash. You also want that 5G network to be available. That means you want, let's say there's a natural disaster, something is happening, and you don't want the communication systems to go down. So it's really important that the CIA of security is maintained for the 5G network. Who are the main contenders for building the 5th generation network? Huawei has the largest market share at the moment with 28%. That's a study done by IHA's Market. Second largest is Sweden's Ericsson with 27%, and then Nokia with 23%, ZTE with 13%, and Samsung with 3%. And others probably Cisco and similar companies. But yeah, just this graph maybe shows you well that if you governments exclude Huawei and ZTE from their markets, it's almost like 41% of the global market, which is not able to compete within your markets. And a lot of countries have considered it. I think everybody is considering at the moment what they should do. But there's some countries which are much harsher. Let's say Australia has basically excluded the company from competing for its 5G networks. Then Japan issued I think they prevent them from, ZTE and Huawei, from competing within the markets, right? And a lot of Japanese mobile providers have also said that they probably won't use those companies. Then some countries in the EU, including Norway, right? Just 2 days ago there was it in the news, right? That the Norwegian government or the security services are concerned, but also the EU as a whole started considering, the European Commission started to ask themselves whether they should amend a law, a 2016 cybersecurity law passed by the European Union, which could be amended in that way, maybe ban ZTE and Huawei from the markets. So everybody is thinking about it. Again, the core question, are those security concerns substantiated? Is it hard facts or is it politically motivated? In some cases, security concerns are not substantiated, just as was the Bloomberg hack. I don't know if you've read about it, but it was about the supply chain, right? The supply chain was corrupted from China. I think the PLA might have compromised it, and the Bloomberg report relied on 17 intelligence officials who have said that there is a concern, but again, in the following months, nothing really, nothing further was provided in evidence. So we can question this report, especially also because major companies such as Amazon, Apple, even the Department of Homeland Security and the GCHQ, which is the UK equivalent of the NSA, said Bloomberg's supply chain report, we can't confirm that, and we probably don't think that it's true. So yeah, in some cases it's not substantiated. But Bloomberg just had another story 2 days ago, actually, about how Huawei supposedly stole intellectual property in California. So they used got a startup to talk to them, and they might have misused the startup's intellectual property, which was about the phone screens, right? They did like super strong phone screens, and supposedly Huawei stole that intellectual property. But again, this report will unfold, and in the next couple of months we will see whether that is true. But let's have a bit of a longer term picture. Let's not just show at the, look at the news from today, the news from yesterday. Let's look at the hard facts about Huawei's cybersecurity. Let's look at the domestic legal environment and at some cases of espionage. So hopefully that will give us a bit of a deeper view and give us a look beyond the news. GCHQ was mentioned already quite a lot today, but just going to continue. So in the UK, they have the government instituted an evaluation board, and many of you have probably read about it already. I'm just going to shortly say it. And the National Cybersecurity Center is tasked with it. And so they should look at whether Huawei's cybersecurity is okay or not, right? And since, I think, 2010 or 2011, they have issued reports and they have never had any concerns. But last year, in 2018, they wrote again an annual report, and they had two security concerns. The first one was that Huawei's source code can cause systems to behave in different ways in different environments. And unpredictability is an enemy of cybersecurity because you don't want your systems to be unpredictable in different environments, right? So that's already a concern. And the second one is about Huawei uses third-party, apparently their third-party software is not subject to sufficient control. So in that respect, there's another security concern. And so that has been now half a year, right, since July, a bit more. And the UK government has been a bit, according to media reports, they are a bit annoyed because the implementation of the those concerns that were addressed, right, they are not really addressed by Huawei. So that's a problem. And so we'll see how that will unfold. They will, the review board, they will they will issue another report in spring. So we will see what will happen and whether those concerns were addressed or not by Huawei. That was about the cybersecurity, right? There are some concerns. How about the domestic legal environment? Again, Huawei statement, they say that the Chinese law does not grant government the authority to compel firms to install backdoors or listening devices. So they basically say, we don't have any backdoors, we don't compromise security, and so on. But let's have a look at the law, and let's have a look at that. In 2014, the Chinese authorities, they passed a law, which is the counter-espionage law. So it's mostly focused on, let's say, if a foreign country spies on China, then Huawei needs to try to prevent that, right? Which makes sense. They shouldn't be complicit with any other government in spying on the Chinese government. So that makes sense, right? It's quite defensive, like let's more focused on defense of national security. But then 3 years later, another law was passed, the National Intelligence Law. And so there's more emphasis on the offense. So in there, it says that any organization or citizen shall support, assist in, and cooperate in national intelligence work in accordance with the law and keep confidential the national intelligence work that it or he or she knows. So that means that you need to be more active as a company, and Huawei is also part of that, any organization, right? And they need to actively engage in intelligence, they need to engage, help with intelligence work, and even if they do it, they can't tell you about it. right? So that's the problem. So that previous statement, they can't say what, if something is happening, they couldn't say that it's happening. But let's say Huawei doesn't know about the espionage, right? Let's say maybe the government just spies on them, is in their systems, but they don't know about it. And that happened also with the Cisco servers, where the NSA intercepted the Cisco servers, which were supposed to go abroad, right? And they put some backdoors in there, and Cisco didn't know about it, right? So maybe Huawei is in that situation. Maybe they just have no idea that things are happening. Similar situation with Google, where the NSA hacked into Google, and I think it's in between the communications within the Google offices. The information was not encrypted, and the NSA in that way had access to Google's user informations. What if Huawei is just like those two companies and they have no idea of what is happening? Well, Wen Zhengfei, the founder and president of Huawei, says that they are in that situation. They haven't been asked to share improper information about Huawei's partners, and I personally, as the founder, would never harm the interest of my customers and me, and my company would not answer to requests. So he thinks that's basically the case, that they are not cooperating. Does anyone know this building? Seem familiar or not so familiar? It's the African Union's headquarters in Addis Ababa. And it's a very shiny building, and that's a photo of the opening ceremony in 2012. See, people are quite fancily dressed, and everyone was quite happy because China entirely financed the building. It was around $200 million. They built the concrete, but they also built the telecommunications networks. And who was the company building that equipment, or who was providing it? You can imagine who it was. Huawei. And they provided the desktop cloud solution for the African Union's headquarters. They installed the Wi-Fi hotspots. They also trained a lot of the African Union's Commission's technical experts. So the African Union Commission is the equivalent of the EU Commission. It's like the executive arm of the AU. And here you can see on the Huawei website how the report on that, when they built it and so on, and how they also trained experts and so on. And the company says also, yes, our competitive advantage is that we have enhanced information security, our data is safe and so on, our cloud is safe. And they said that in respect to this project with the African Union. But the thing is that for 5 years, there was something going on. From 2012 to 2017, data was transferred from Addis Ababa, so from those headquarters that we just saw, to Shanghai. Every night from midnight till 2 a.m., data was flowing, and without the African Union knowing it. And as a consequence, in 2017, there was a Le Monde report which said that those things were happening. And as a consequence, the African Union changed. They got their own computer servers, so they got different computer servers, and they also enhanced the encryption policies within the organization. And China offered that they could configure the new servers, but the African Union declined, which is quite makes sense. But just to be fair, GCHQ, again mentioned, right? They intercepted the communication between the African Union and the UN in 2009 and 2010, according to the Snowden revelation. So a lot of countries are spying, right? Not only Huawei. Let's have a look further. Another espionage case in Poland, people might be more familiar because it's more recent and there was more in the news. But basically, there was, you can see again, Huawei, their statement that they were involved in Poland in a project called Seeds for the Future, which is aimed at, let's say, they have competitions at universities, and the best students, they can go afterwards to China and stay there a bit, get a bit of a working environment experience within Huawei. They learn a bit of Mandarin, they go out, see a bit, have a bit of a sightseeing, get knowledge with the culture and the history of the country. And so who are the two individuals which were allegedly spying involved in spying. So that was Wang Weijing, who was an Huawei employee who was fired afterwards, right? We've heard that in the beginning. And then there's Piotr Durbailo, who was within the intelligence community. He was formerly in the intelligence community. And what do those two individuals have together, or in common, let's say? That they both had a connection to the Military University of Technology in Warsaw. So Piotr, he was a lecturer there in cryptography, I think, and Wang Weijing visited the university in regards to the Seeds for the Future project. So that's what the two had in common. But yeah, let's see what that was. Again, it could be that Huawei just didn't know about it and they immediately fired the employee. So we looked at the cybersecurity, we looked at the domestic legal environment, we looked at those few espionage cases. What should European governments do with those concerns? I think there's three options. One of the options is let's just leave it as it is. Let's just let some the telecommunication providers to inspect that equipment. Let's just leave it. But in that case, similar things could happen as in Addis Abeba, right? If you don't inspect it thoroughly, things could happen that Huawei cybersecurity or equipment is being compromised. Also, we don't address what's happening within China, right? The law stays the same, we just don't do anything. And I think if we leave it as it is, then the espionage, the risk of espionage is quite high. What we could do similar things as the US, Australia, New Zealand, Poland, and other countries, and the European governments could be harsh and just say, no, we don't take in any equipment, we use different providers, that risk is too big. But I think there is, we would address some issues because we just wouldn't have, as a government or European governments wouldn't have the equipment, right? Then there is no real concern. But again, espionage could happen. Even if you have different providers, there's no 100% cybersecurity. Your systems could be still compromised. And could be consequences if you just ban it on national security grounds. ZTE and Huawei, you could have less choice, right? As we've seen earlier in the graph, it's 41% of you're shutting out 41% of the market. It could lead to a fragmentation of global commerce. Maybe you have already supply chain, you have a supply chain, right, with Huawei and so on. It would just be costlier to use different supply chains, and it would lead somehow to different systems within the world where some regions would use this equipment and others this equipment. They would just like be, let's say, interoperable. Everything would be a bit more difficult. And it could also backfire. China could just say the same. We don't take in European companies because we have national security concerns as well, right? And that's still a market of over 1 billion people. So that could be the consequences. In specific cases in Australia, it was a bit harsher, let's say. The Global Times, a Chinese newspaper who is also known to be very close to the party, said that, to the Communist Party, said that those who willfully hurt Chinese companies with an excuse of national security will meet their nemesis. Quite strong statement. This Commerce Ministry was a bit more, let's say, a bit more subtle, and they said Australia should look at our trade ties and, yeah, just think about it. Something could happen. Then Canada, again, many people could have read, right? There was more on a personal basis. After the arrest of Huawei CFO, some people were detained. Canadian citizens were detained in China. The ex-diplomat Michael Kovrig, he was detained for reasons of national security. Similarly, businessman Michael Spavor. And then there was a third individual which was already convicted of drug dealing. But again, the case was, I think, reopened and he just got the death penalty instead of 15 years in jail. So yeah, there could be consequences, right, if you just exclude the two companies, ZTE and Huawei, from building the 5G network. Then there's a third option, right, which would be what the UK does. You would have the intelligence community looking at your at Huawei equipment, and Germany instituted something something similar, and Singapore might as well. But then there is the question, if it's a smaller country, the question is if they can really do it, right? The UK has GCHQ, they have a large, let's say, intelligence capabilities. You could say maybe, yes, they are confident that they can actually do their job, but a lot of countries can't, right? So if you do that, right, the UK has done it since 2010 or 2011 with 3G and 4G equipment and so on. But now it's 5G. Is that different? Could that change the thinking? Huawei says there's no real difference between 4G and 5G. But again, Ian Levy, the technical director of the National Cybersecurity Center, actually, which is within GCHQ, says that 5G is different than 4G because just there's a lot of data flowing and you can't process everything centrally. A lot of things will happen at the edges and it won't be as centrally operated. And what the UK did previously with 3G and 4G is that they tried to isolate equipment. So they would have a bit of Huawei equipment, they would have a bit of, let's say, Ericsson or a bit of Nokia, a bit of Samsung, a bit of Cisco, and so on. And that's how they could mitigate the threats of espionage. But with 5G, that's harder because of the properties that we have just looked at. So yes, if we increase the security screenings, maybe some larger countries can have that increase the cybersecurity, right? They could look at the hard facts, they could look at the hardware, the software, and so on. But again, what does all the cybersecurity help you if you have if Huawei still has to share data with the government, right? Even the best security doesn't help if you are basically supposed to share your data. And I think so the risk of espionage is still quite elevated because of the domestic laws. So what I would suggest is to separate the Huawei's domestic corporate infrastructure from the international infrastructure. And The Economist proposed a couple of things on how that could be done. They say that, yes, they need, Huawei needs to, and also ZTE, they need to appoint international directors, foreign directors. They need to establish subsidiaries abroad, which would have independent boards and local managers. So they really need to make, let's say, the external operations independent from the domestic. And I think in that way, also the domestic legal environment would be better addressed because, and also more trust could be built, right? At the moment, there's not much trust, I suppose, between some governments and Huawei, and that's just because the governance infrastructure within Huawei is very opaque, right? A lot of people don't know what's going on. Everything is quite based around Shenzhen, which is the headquarters, and so on. So I think, as we have seen today across the different cases, with censorship in Canada and with WeChat, with surveillance in Venezuela, and espionage, I think what is happening at home in China is also being reflected abroad, right? And so I think there are concerns. So we need to have those. If as a nation, as a European government, you can do security screenings, if you feel confident that you can do it, right? If you think that your intelligence community is good enough, then you should do those screenings. And maybe if you don't have those capabilities, maybe there could be some pooling between countries in sharing that vetting, because it also costs resources, right? You need to devote people from the intelligence community in order to do those screenings, right? It's a cost for you to devote those resources. So maybe there could be some pooling of resources, and then there should be also, to address the legal environment within China, I think there should be a separation between the domestic and international corporate infrastructure. And I think with that, I'm happy to take questions. If anything was unclear, if you have further questions, yeah, I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you. Awesome. Perfect. I think you.
Yeah.
This is exactly what you wanted to learn about. At least you're spot on for my concern. I get many phone calls from journalists, and I'm not as set an expert as you are, so I try to my best and I haven't been too wrong, but there are a lot more details here. I would like to ask one more before I open up. When it comes to the 5G in particular, you talk about espionage, how the system can be used. But can you say a few more words about, is it only espionage at the malicious actors that control the 5G network, or is it also like sabotage, can like turn it off? As you talked about a little bit, you alluded to it earlier, but is that also part of the threat picture?
It could be it could be happening. There could be a kill switch. I think in an interview with the FT, I think there were. I think it was Ian Levy who said again there could be a kill switch. Things could be just if the Chinese government decided to turn off the equipment, they could do it easier if Huawei supplied that equipment. So yes, the availability of the network would also be in danger if things were going really bad, I think, yeah.
But if you have screened it like the Brits do with its security center, that screen the systems, is that because then they wouldn't have discovered that possibility, or is it through an update or something that comes later on because these softwares are regularly updated? What you...
Yeah, I think I think they also vet the software updates.
Okay.
So, but again, there's no 100% security, but I think they feel quite confident that they could do it and make it secure enough, I suppose.
Okay, so they think that. So then it's possible to mitigate the threat. You can never 100% secure, but if through such centers and enough resources, you could kind of reduce the possibility of a kill switch.
Again, and then you would ask yourself, oh, are we really in that situation where someone would have a motive to shut off everything, right? That would be a big move to do. Right. And yeah, the situation would have to deteriorate very much, I think, for China to have that motive to do that.
Right. Now, one topic, I mean, China is denying Western, primarily American companies full access to their markets based on security reasons, right? But security for them is a little bit different. It's about, as you say, to what you call individual freedoms to search whatever you want, right? And so in one way, it's the tit for tat already started. You said there was a risk of tit for tat, but couldn't be an argument that, well, you're doing it with us, so we will do it. We have different perception of security, but still, it is security.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid argument. Apple, for instance, they need to do a joint venture for their cloud within China, so they need to have a domestic company who is I think running their cloud services, and they need to have on national security concerns again. They have to share have a joint venture with a domestic company on that issue. And some companies are just shut out of the market, just as Google, Facebook, Twitter, which are not accessible within China. So you could say, yes, the tit for tat has already started, and the tit came from the other side.
There.
Exactly.
Right, okay. All right, let's open up for questions. Who's first? Sir, hold there. Please state your name and affiliation, and make sure it's a question.
Yes. I'll try. My name is Geir Amnefjell. I'm from Norwegian newspaper Dagbladet. I was wondering, are there any signs that Huawei are ready to separate the domestic corporate infrastructure from the international?
I haven't seen it. Really good question. I was looking for that a lot. I haven't found anything. I think in many cases, such as with Australia, and I think also with Norway, the argument would be there's just no such law that would require us to do that, right? They're just like denying that something like that exists, but they are not proposing any changes. So they haven't yet come forward and said, yes, we want to establish some trust. What they do say is they say we will invest into cybersecurity, we will open some offices. I think they said they would invest 2 billion into cybersecurity. But again, that doesn't really address the issue, right? As you said, of the domestic legal environment. So on that matter, I haven't heard of anything where they would try to build trust in that way.
Okay, other questions? Yes, sir.
Yes,
Yes, hi. Per Anders Johansen from Aftenposten. Could you comment a little bit more on the big hack story that Bloomberg did? Because I believe that is one of the stories that make this topic reach the highlights. Why, do you believe in it?
So I think that supply chain risk is a real concern. I think the Americans are concerned because, as you have seen, they have done it previously, so they know it's possible. So I think their concerns are maybe substantiated because they have first-hand experience of it. I think on the Bloomberg story, I wouldn't know. I couldn't say that it was right because there was just no further evidence. Bloomberg stood with it. They said, "Yeah, we did still a good story. It's still true." But if they don't provide any evidence, I don't think they supplied any photos of any of the compromised chips. They didn't have any further evidence. I think that wasn't really substantiated. But again, if you think about supply chain risk, I think companies can handle quite well. Like, let's say if Apple produces their phones within China, I think they can do a quite good job at providing the supply chain. They have their own operational security and so on. So I think they can do a quite good job at that. And everything, most devices are made in China, right? I think if we start there, then it would be really difficult to separate I think it's difficult to nationalize supply chains. I don't think also it's a good idea because we wouldn't know where to stop, right? I mean, even the PowerPoint clicker here probably is, made in China and so on. So yeah, it's just too intertwined, I think. And I don't think it's a realistic scenario to do that today. And I think it's overblown to do that. Yeah.
To follow up on that, well, the rest of you think, isn't that what we've seen in cybersecurity? I mean, the main kind of challenge has been the kind of cheap little devices, not the iPad, but those little things, they are little cameras and other things that don't get updates. They're cheaply made, so they have low security protocols, and that's we've seen like dolls that've been hacked and things like that. So in general cybersecurity, the thousands of little devices that are connected, there's so many ways in, right?
I agree. Yeah. And there's a problem within the market. There's a market failure because the companies don't. No company has an incentive, let's say, to really invest into security, because if you make a cheap device, you get it out there, and it's really hard also to update IoT devices. So at the moment, there is no real security built within there, and it doesn't matter where that company comes from. So within IoT, I think there is just like a big things to do. So we need to also change the incentives for the companies maybe, and build better security, whatever system we use, whatever cameras, whatever Internet of Things devices we use, we need to increase the standards, make it a bit better, maybe address that issue. I think just increase general cybersecurity in order to make us safer from all attacks, whether that's from the private sector, or whether that's from cyber criminals, whether that's from nation states. We should just make cybersecurity better. Yeah.
I would like to return to. Sorry, what's the hand there? Yeah, go ahead, because I just talk because I don't see any hands. Yeah. I can ask 10 questions.
The stream technician wants you to stand closer.
All for the.
Well, pleasure.
Peter Otis from Telenor. Thank you for an excellent presentation. I wondered if you could reflect a little bit more on the legal part of it, the domestic laws, and whether you have seen anything or whether you foresee anything in terms of any changes to that, any pushback, because you made the point several times, which is, despite any cybersecurity mitigations, the laws would still apply and don't provide trust, and so presumably this would have a commercial effect on the vendors. So do you foresee any change on that front to change the wording in a way that would provide some trust to companies or governments that have concerns?
So I think the problem with the laws is that they are very vague, right? So they are not. They don't say, the government doesn't require you to install backdoors, right? But it requires you to cooperate with the intelligence community. And I think as long as the laws are as vague, it's really difficult to have a I think not to have any concerns, and I haven't seen anything recently that would make the situation better. I think it's just gone, basically, it's deteriorated with the new cybersecurity laws, and also what I think there was a new law which said that even ISP providers need to put more and more access domestically. So I think it's not going the better way, and the problem is just that the laws could be interpreted in different ways, and I think it's difficult to rely to base a judgment on that matter. I think, and there's just many laws, I suppose, which could be interpreted in different ways.
All right, we have a question back there, Lars.
Hi, Lars Jesvik. I'm at the Cybersecurity Center here at NUPI. Several Western American firms have taken a quite independent stance when it comes to global internet governance. I think of Microsoft and Apple, which is sometimes challenging the US government. Sometimes it's more of a digital Geneva Convention. Does Chinese companies pursue the same kind of strategies? And if not, why not?
Good point. Yes, I think some of those initiatives are marketing gags, right? Apple took privacy. They say, oh yeah, we uphold your privacy. Then Microsoft came along. Okay, we might not do privacy anymore, but we want to encourage peace. Yeah. And it doesn't cost them anything, right? It doesn't cost them in that. It just brings them, I think, benefits because they're seen as good and so on. But maybe, that would be a good suggestion for Huawei to do. But what they do is, again, they said they would invest into cybersecurity. They just say, we are secure. Apple says privacy, Microsoft says peace, we say cybersecurity. Maybe that's their part. But I haven't seen any other companies doing similar, Chinese companies doing similar things.
Yes.
One more question about the legal issues. What are the differences between the laws that we have, for instance, in UK and Norway, which also entitle companies like Telenor to facilitate and help the Norwegian or the British intelligence for help, and the laws you have in China? What are the main differences?
The main differences are, firstly, I think that there are no conservative or liberal party committees within companies. I think that's one difference probably. There is laws that in the UK, I think the Investigatory Powers Act, which should allow companies have to cooperate and so on. But I think the difference is that here the situation is different because we have end-to-end encryption. Let's say you can use WhatsApp and so on, and in there I don't think the government has any way of accessing your communications. So if you want to make as an individual, if you want to be secure, you can be quite secure, I think. But yeah, I think it would be hypocritical to say that the intelligence services here don't want to have access to their let's say if they have a law, or if there's law enforcement who wants to do an investigation, they probably need access. But again, I think it is a different situation because I think companies here are really private, right? Most companies are international. They have international boards. They would have board members, I don't know, from different countries. Like let's say Ericsson. I think they have people who who are from the US, who have degrees even in different countries, right? I don't think Huawei. I think there was an article saying that no board member at Huawei has even an international degree. Like they don't really seem to have any incentive of. Let's say, I think it is different. Yes.
If I may add on that, a couple of 3-4 hands now, perfect. I want to add quickly. I think it's important, at least for Norway, we don't know about other countries, but I mean, when police wants to get access to the system, they have a court order to a certain individual that they want to track. It's not bulk collection for industrial espionage. Right? That is, somewhat different. But of course, it's in the Snowden case, which as you refer to, of course, said it's not black and white for sure. Okay, we have 4 hands. Excellent. So I'll collect 2. You over there first.
Thank you. My name is Alisa, also from Telenor, and since I'm from Telenor and it was mentioned, I thought I'd just comment on the question regarding the differences just in terms of how I see it. So in Norway we have very strict legal processes and judicial kind of protection mechanisms to avoid just how data is being used and how governments can get access. And I think also the concern from the Western point of view in terms of China is that they want quite broad access to data to gain economic advantages. While in Norway, for instance, if the intelligence community wants access to data from Telenor, it's in very specific cases. So it's police investigations, concerns related to terrorism or other national security issues. So the scope is just much more specific than what the concern with China is. And building on that, I'm wondering if you could reflect a bit on if there's something with the strategic context and China's strategic objectives that can help us understand the development with both the expansion with the new intelligence law in 2017, but also what could come further, given that they have a strategic interest in being an economic superpower, and this is deteriorating their relationships in that sphere with the West. Could that force a change in the surveillance interest of China?
Yeah, so I think on that grounds of espionage for economic gains, the main concern was that, let's say, the Chinese government would spy on Western companies and then transfer it to their private companies, or there would be also concerns of, I think, just like Huawei, again with the case of stealing intellectual property with the Bloomberg story 2 days ago, which was about stealing that basically that screen, right, and using it for their purposes. So they would definitely have different standards. Then there was a case with T-Mobile where they took also some intellectual property and they settled the case without outside of the court. So there were definitely issues with that, and I think the government is also actively, what's the problem is that the government is actively supporting those national champions, right? You see them as national champions, and they would try to give them that intelligence that they gain. And I think there was a US official saying that those hacking attempts were the largest transfer of wealth in history, right? What went in intellectual property from the US to China. So I think in that larger strategic objective, a lot of things are being done to undermine companies in Europe and in the US in order to further companies such as Huawei. And again, Huawei receives a lot of state subsidies, right? Which some may also say is like gives them a competitive advantage, right? Because the state really kind of furthers their objective. And so I think in the larger picture, China also proposed a strategy where they want to have all the some technologies like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, all those things, they want to be the first ones, right? And now the question is how they're going to reach it, right? They do investments at home, but they also want to gain access to that technology from other countries. So I think in that larger strategic picture, the government goals align very much with what the private companies in China want. And again, there it's a bit blurry what is being transferred between the government and the private sector, because their goals align, right? Huawei wants to have, or ZTE and so on, they want to have a larger market share. And if they can gain it also with the aid of the government, then they would probably, yeah, some people would say that they would take on that offer. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So we have 3 more questions at least. There's Henrik there.
Henrik Kim, I'm here with NUPI. Thanks for an interesting presentation. I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on the espionage risk, because you mentioned 2 sort of recent and famous cases, the AU headquarters case and the alleged case in Poland. But you also mentioned that, I mean, we don't know if these were indeed cases of espionage, what Huawei knew about these cases. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about the risks, whether you think it's sort of Huawei actively cooperating with the Chinese security services, or more sort of unwittingly being used as a platform for espionage, because that divide is is really important.
So I think for the Poland case, it's more difficult to say because it was so recent. But I think for the Addis Abeba, for the African Union headquarters case, I think it's very difficult for Huawei to say that they weren't aware of what was going on. I think because they were building all the ICT equipment, and there were also reports that the same offices, they were also bugged, so there were microphones and so on within the offices. So I think if you supply equipment and you don't see microphones and so on, then I think that could put in question. And also the time frame of the espionage case of 5 years from 2012 to 2017 is a long term, that's quite long term. Even in cybersecurity terms, a breach is often discovered a bit earlier. So I think also because the data wasn't flowing to any other country, it was flowing to Shanghai. I think that makes it even a bit more difficult, I think, and also because of it makes it difficult for Huawei, I think, to say we weren't involved. But of course, they can't say that they would be involved, right? It wouldn't make sense. But I think the circumstantial or the facts or what we can see, right, as observers and as people who maybe don't have access to classified intelligence documents, I think that's how we can shape our opinion, I think, on those facts. And I think on those facts, it's difficult for Huawei to deny an involvement in the African Union case.
Great. So we have two hands back there. Maybe you can take both if you can manage
sure.
to remember.
Yeah,
if you're not, you
of
can get
course.
your notebook. But
Hi, Jack Simpson, University of Edinburgh. You put a lot of emphasis on the laws in China and the compulsions that puts on citizens and companies, but I'm curious, if the Chinese government repealed those laws tomorrow, how seriously would your risk assessment reduce of the potential for the compulsion of organizations and individuals to act at the behest of state coercion?
Exactly. Yeah, it wouldn't change very much because often you could still do it without the law, right? You could get just go into a company and say we need your data, and I don't think an enterprise would have any kind of legal rights of saying no, you won't do it, especially because they are so reliant on state subsidies and so on. It makes it difficult for them to say no, even if it's without the law, right? What will you do if officials show up, or if the intelligence community shows up at your doors? I think it's very difficult to refuse it, even if they don't cite the article of that law. I think it's quite well understood that you need to give access to the data. So I agree with you, even if the law was changed, that there would be still concerns. Yeah.
Boils down to trust, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Hello, Agathe Lom from KPMG. I have a question related to the trade tensions or trade war, depending on how you want to frame it, and the case of Huawei. And in the sense, it goes back to the options you laid out and the risk of fragmentation, and with actually the strategy of the US administration, and how much of the tensions with Huawei are driven by this strategy to raise the stake actually with China. And if the risk of fragmentation that you laid out is more of actually a goal, a policy goal, than a side effect of the tensions with China on cybersecurity, to isolate the supply chains and maybe forcing US industries to step up and take the leadership by isolating their rivals.
So the question is, or the understatement is, that there is an overlap between the political motive and the economic or the security allegations. Yeah, I think there were different statements on that from the US government. Trump said that those two are tied somehow, but then again other officials said, I think the Treasury Secretary said they are not. Of course, the US is concerned, I suppose, because they see the interlinkage and of the dual technology. A lot of the 5G technology would also enable militaries to operate in different ways, I suppose. It would give them a competitive edge. The ones who will build those networks across the world will have an edge. Also in military terms, the Bloomberg story about that intellectual property theft of that screen, right, which is super hard, could also be, it's diamond glass. I think it could be also used for laser technology, which could be used within the military. So I think their concern is that a lot of that competitive edge within the private sector, which is nowadays more and more intertwined with what the military can do and where the military gets its technology from, there is a very blurry line, I think, and that's why they are concerned. And maybe it's a good reason for them to at least in their case, to tie those two things together. But I think it's different for European governments who don't have such maybe such a strategic vision as the US. I think for them it's more like about the security concerns, but for the US it does make sense to tie those two together in their approach.
Yeah, strategic visions in Europe. Yeah, that's
autonomy.
We miss that these days. And also, if I remember your slide or the 5G providers, there's not really in the US, and Cisco was there maybe, but the US is not really making 5G equipment yet, at least. So there's no like obvious US trade incentive in that term part of it, right?
Yeah, I think for them they have vetted Ericsson and Nokia, I think, previously, so they are quite I think they're happy with taking some of that equipment, or that they have also used other providers, which has been vetted, so they don't have any security concerns, and maybe they also wouldn't have a security concern of those countries spying on the US and having
Finnish
espionage. Yes, yeah.
All right, sir, just wait for microphone, please.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Alex Moltso, and I study social anthropology and informatics, so computer science, at the University of Oslo, and I also run the AI social research group. So we're an interdisciplinary sort of team of different social scientists that sort of like look at how AI is affecting society. So I was just wondering about what do you want us to look at? Like, if, because there's a lot of questions arising now, and, you probably have some really interesting questions, arising from this whole sort of situation. What should we look at?
What you should look at? I think what you should look at is very broad question. What are you looking at the moment? Question back. Yeah. Yeah. Based on such a presentation, I think artificial intelligence can increase cybersecurity in regards to defense. So I think DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency in the US, which is a research agency of the Defense Department, they look at how artificial intelligence could look at code and make it more secure. Let's say, humans are just very fallible and they make mistakes, and artificial intelligence could help to vet the algorithms and make them more secure, have less loopholes, and so on, to make the systems more secure. So I think in cybersecurity terms, that's a major way forward. Yeah.
I would like to return to your third option, and as you know, or as you might know, Norwegian government. Well, you know that Norwegian government is, of course, now considering these options, what to do, right? And of course it is delicate given the Norwegian bilateral relations with China that's just normalized, and of course our close relations with the US at the same time. It's difficult, right? Between a rock and a hard place. It's difficult to be a small country in these cases. I'm quite sure that like a third option looks, intuitively, interesting from a Norwegian point of view. But as you said, it's difficult for small countries because they don't have the capacity, knowledge, expertise to kind of do that kind of vetting. So how, from your expertise, how far is the cooperation? I mean, if you like call GCHQ, say, hey, can we join you? I mean, how difficult do you think it is to build a kind of pan-European or European among close allies or something, to come together to build this kind of vetting systems or security centers as a third option?
Yeah, I think the question is in how far they would be. That might be also intelligence knowledge, right? To know like what could be the security issues, the security flaws, because they have a lot of knowledge probably about how to exploit the system, and they would probably, I don't know how willing they would be to cooperate on that matter, but I'm sure if there's a will, there's a way. If you want to cooperate with some other European countries on that issue, you could I think, as regards to trade sanctions and so on, I think there was, what was it, with Liu Xiaobo and so on, there was some tension between Norway and China. But if there is maybe a group of countries which take a similar step, then maybe the impact is smaller in taking out specific countries or sanctioning specific countries. I think then the damage might be lower if there's a common response, right? Maybe really the goal is of whatever the answer to that security concern is. It should be a collective one, I think.
And you mentioned that European Commission is considering revising the Security Act.
Exactly.
How far down the process is that? Do you know?
I'm not.
EU processes. Sorry, a difficult question.
Yeah, very, very. It's gonna take some time.
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
All right, I'll leave you with that. So there's another question there, sir. And just wait for microphone.
Hi, Theodore from CS Security. Wondering in regards to Huawei's and China's sudden interest in the development in Africa, in relations to, for example, the Chinese Railway Corporation, CREC, which is then state-owned. In regards to CREC, it is maybe also due to finding stones in regards to trade. But why do you think that there is a sudden interest in developing in Africa? Is it because of the cheap materials and labor cost, which makes it more efficient for Africa, or is there something else?
So I think it's part of the larger Belt and Road Initiative, which tries to tie China to Africa and also to, but also to Europe. But so I think the general goal of China is to make everything a bit more China-centric. So they need to build roads which lead to the ports, which lead to China, and also because they have a large domestic need for whether that's energy and so on, so they need better roads to get that to China. But I think in regards to telecommunications equipment, because they build a lot of internet infrastructure within Africa, right? So I think they went into markets which were previously neglected by other providers and so on, or other companies, and they could provide cheap telecommunications and so on. So I think I think other people could have also gone in, right, and done that investment. And it's similar in Europe with the 5G network, right? It's not really, it's a risky thing to do because the returns are not too big in Europe on investing in that, building that network. So I think Huawei is also a welcome competition in that respect, right? That they actually want to invest into Europe in that respect. So I don't know, have I answered your question? Yes?
All right. Well, we still have time for more questions. Yes, sir? Just wait for microphone.
My name is Jan Feilberg. I'm working with the Ministry of Trade and Industry. When talking about 5G and cybersecurity, we're now very much focusing on one company, one country. And there's not that many countries, I mean, building the networks and the components for enabling suppliers for the 5G. But in Norway, I mean, the national security challenges and the espionage challenges, we are more concerned with one country closer to us, to the east, than with China. And also we know that will also have a though they're not suppliers of technology to the 5G and things like that, they have the capacities. Is there a danger that we now forget or underestimate in this process, this discussion, challenges coming from other countries than China when we consider the different options? I mean, for development of 5G, and how do we address the challenges coming from these countries?
Would you maybe specify a little bit, or I don't know, just.
I mean, for Norway, I mean, Russia is a much bigger national security challenge than China.
Definitely. So I think no matter what the provider, they would try to access your systems, and every country spies. In that respect, it's really important, to make systems as secure as possible. And they have the motive, probably, to go into Norwegian systems, and that motive won't change with the provider, I think, on that issue. I think in that respect, it's good to establish resilience and defense in that respect to address those concerns, because it won't change the motives of countries such as Russia to gain intelligence on Norway and so on. So I think, the emphasis should be in defense.
To chip in that, somebody in these debates have been saying that we should kind of limit supply chain procurement from companies we have security agreements with. So that it would be NATO, but also Sweden and Finland, which are not part of NATO, and Austria, of course, your country. That's one way of kind of reining in maybe those concerns. That of course Russia fortunately doesn't make anything the world wants, except oil. So that's it's not a tempting supplier. But at least in the debate, that's been one way of kind of legally framing it. I don't know to what would work. Right. Did you have a hand? Yes. Then you get the microphone.
Håvard Fossen from Inside Telecom. It's somewhat the same question. I feel that inside your presentation, you have the assumption that it's far more easy for Huawei or the Chinese government to spy via Huawei than to spy via Ericsson's equipment. And if you think on the question he asked, can you elaborate on that? Why is it so much easier for China to spy through their equipment?
Okay. Now it's a bit more clear for me as well. I think it's because if you have really inside knowledge of how the network works, if you know all the components of how the system is being run, then you have a better chance of exploiting it. It doesn't mean that you, let's say, what you could do is just not intentionally. What you could do is intentionally not fix some bugs, right? You could do that. You could say, oh, we're not gonna enhance security in this way, and that could be exploited by the state. So I think if you have really knowledge of how the networks work, how the software is built, the hardware, especially on the software front, then you could have also a better way of spying on other countries. And then with the hardware, on the hardware issue, I think if you supply the hardware, it's also easier to intercept it before it goes outside the country.
Okay, so also all the way back, wasn't it? Yes, there we go, hidden.
Hi, Christine Ness, student at SERI. I was just wondering, because you sort of compared being spied on by China to being spied on from the UK and the NSA, which are inherently democratic countries. Isn't there a difference there that we should take account of in the ways we have of addressing by democratic means the espionage from those countries?
Can you repeat the question? Or
I was just wondering, being spied on by China is different because we don't have the same democratic means as we do with, for example, UK or US. Is there a factor in the things you're saying?
Yeah, definitely. And also, it's not only about it's definitely about the democratic values, but it's also about that we have common interests, supposedly, right? Norway is part of NATO. Norway does some intelligence sharing with other nations, also I think with the US, and it gets intelligence back and so on. So there is trust in that relationship, right? There is a lot of cooperation, similar values, similar interests, supposedly, I think, as well. And in that respect, I think you pick who spies on you, and then I think you make the choice. Yeah, spying is the second oldest business, they say. It's just, it is occurring, but I think you can have less concerns if some countries spy on you than others. Yeah.
We should know as Norwegians that most of our internet traffic goes through Sweden and UK, so it's like sending an email, sending a postcard. It's being read by anyone who wants to, right? Right, and at our hands, we still have a few more minutes, but we have addressed a lot of topics. I think also those are going to make difficult decisions in the government in Norway have got some ideas they can chew on. Then I would just like to thank you so much for your time. You are hitting a flight back very soon now to go to the US, are you?
Yeah, to Boston.
All right, so all the best, and let's all give him a big hand, shall we?
Thank you.
Thank you.